A shocking new statistic proves Seattle's homelessness strategy is a total failure. But you'll never believe what Democrats are blaming. Welcome to the Jason Rantz Show, presented by None Better Tax Resolution. According to the most recent point-in-time count, King County homelessness hit 16,385. That's the highest it's ever been here. And that number is likely dramatically lower than the true number. It represents a 23% jump from 2022. Now, as troubling, there was a 15.7% surge in people living in shelters. Now, you might think that that's a positive number, but in the context of all of these stats, all it means is that people will go into shelter and then stay there. A reasonable person could call this further proof of Democrat homelessness policy failures. But the very Democrats in power responsible for all these failures, well, they're of course never going to admit it. All the while continuing to bolster their budgets and their bank accounts. In 2023, the King County Regional Homelessness Authority, they had a budget of $253 million. That doesn't even account for the dollars spent by the city of Seattle and others in addressing the other issues caused by homelessness. And what's come of all this spending? Record high drug overdose deaths, disproportionately hitting the homeless, of course. Property crime so high that businesses and property owners themselves, they don't even report it to the police anymore. And of course, you've got more people living on the streets. They're using our parks, our sidewalks as toilets, storefronts as drug dens, and alleyways as bedrooms. What's the grand plan here? You're actually looking at it. The problem boils down to two misguided strategies. We talked about them before: harm reduction and housing first. Now, harm reduction is a fancy term for giving addicts clean needles and fentanyl pipes, supposedly to make them seek treatment. Spoiler, it doesn't. All it does is enable addiction. And then there's housing first, which puts people in homes without addressing why they're homeless in the first place. It should be called housing forever, because that's what it is. Free housing with no requirement to get clean or sober. They can keep using with subsidized drug paraphernalia while they're in the subsidized housing that we're giving them. Does that make sense to anyone? No, that's why it's failing. Rather than review the data and admit that they are at fault, the people to blame for this mess, they're quadrupling down on the failures. Again, they're framing this as a housing affordability issue. You see, a spokesperson for the King County executive, Dow Constantine, told the Seattle Times that, quote, the number of people experiencing homelessness is directly tied to a lack of housing options in our region, and it's only increasing. If it wasn't so tragic, that would be so incredibly laughable. But this cluelessness is costing lives. You couldn't even get evicted during COVID, and yet homelessness still rose. Explain that. This isn't about housing costs. It's about the refusal to admit that drug addiction is the real driver of homelessness, worsened by this belief that housing is a human right. So what's the solution? Well, first, stop enabling the drug use. Let's focus on treatment and accountability. Second, you make housing conditional on addressing the root causes of homelessness. You give them support, but you got to do it with strings attached. And finally, we got to start holding our leaders accountable for these failed policies. They're to blame and they face no consequences. If we do all of this, we're going to see real change. Fewer people on the streets, fewer overdose deaths, and safer communities. But Democrats are still unwilling to acknowledge reality. And it's all made worse by their insistence that, again, housing is a human right. When you base policies on bumper sticker slogans like that, and all those good vibes, you end up with over 16,000 people living on the streets. And that's a failure. Jason Rantz here with Greg Nunn, your local tax expert and advocate. Greg, thank you so much for coming on.
Hey, Jason, great to be with you again and talk about these tax issues.
So some folks out there have the IRS calling them nonstop or even coming to their door. What do you recommend they do?
You are protected by statute, by law, that when you have representation, they have to deal with your representative. And I am acting in your best interest when I'm dealing with the IRS. And I tell you, you don't want to talk to them, it'll just stress you out.
If you're having trouble with the IRS, then call Greg Nunn. Greg might be able to negotiate a settlement for up to 85% off the original amount owed, and that includes penalties and interest. Call Greg Nunn today. Did you like that commentary? Make sure you subscribe to the podcast of The Jason Rantz Show. Get it at KTTH.com or wherever it is you download your podcasts.